Dear learners, welcome you all to e-learning platform. This is week 8. In this week we are going to learn a new text, the novel Pride and Prejudice, written by Jane Austen. Let's begin. In this lesson you will learn a biography of Jane Austen, an introduction to Pride and Prejudice, with a summary of chapter 1 to 20. The full novel consists of over 60 chapters. Bio of Jane Austen. Jane Austen, born December 16, 1775, is Steventon, Hampshire, England. Died July 18, 1870 in Winchester, Hampshire. An English writer who first gave the novel its distinctly modern character through her treatment of ordinary people in everyday life. She published 4 novels during her lifetime: Sense and Sensibility in 1811, Pride and Prejudice in 1813, Mansfield Park in 1814, and Emma in 1815. In these and in Persuasion and Northumberland, published together posthumously in 1817, she vividly depicted English middle-class life during the early 19th century. Her novels defined the era's novel of manners, but they also became timeless classics that remain critical and popular successes for over 2 centuries after her death. Jane Austen's life. Jane Austen was born in the Hampshire village of Steventon, where her father, the Reverend George Austen, was rector. She was the second daughter and 7th child in a family of 8, 6 boys and 2 girls. Her closest companion throughout her life was her elder sister, Cassandra. Neither Jane nor Cassandra married. Their father was a scholar who encouraged the love of learning in his children. Introduction to Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice, romantic novel by Jane Austen, published anonymously in 3 volumes in 1813. A classic of English literature written with incisive wit and superb character delineation. It centers on the burgeoning relationship between Elizabeth Bennet, the daughter of a country gentleman, and Fitzwilliam Darcy, a rich aristocratic landowner. Upon publication, Pride and Prejudice was well received by critics and readers. The first edition sold out within the first year, and it never went out of print. Summary of Pride and Prejudice. The novel opens with one of the most famous lines in English literature. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. The statement is seemingly what Mrs. Bennett thinks as she sets her sights on the newly arrived Bingley, who she is sure will make a suitable husband for one of her daughters. At a ball, Bingley takes an immediate interest in the beautiful and shy Jane. The encounter between his friend Darcy and Elizabeth is less cordial, although Austen shows them intrigued by each other. She reverses the convention of first impressions, the pride of rank and fortune and prejudice against the social inferiority of Elizabeth's family hold Darcy aloof, while the pride of self-respect and prejudice against Darcy's snobbery hold Elizabeth equally aloof. The pompous Colin soon arrives, hoping to marry one of the Bennet sisters. Mrs. Bennet steers him toward Elizabeth, but the latter refuses his offer of marriage. He instead becomes engaged to her friend Charlotte. During this time, Elizabeth encounters the charming Wickham. There is a mutual attraction between the two, and he informs her that Darcy has denied him his inheritance. After Bingley abruptly departs for London, Elizabeth's dislike for Darcy mounts as she becomes convinced that he is discouraging Bingley's relationship with Jane. Darcy, however, has grown increasingly fond of Elizabeth, admiring her intelligence and vitality. While visiting the now married Charlotte, Elizabeth sees Darcy, who professes his love for her and proposes. A surprised Elizabeth refuses his offer, and when Darcy demands an explanation, she accuses him of breaking up Jane and Bingley and of denying Wickham his inheritance. Darcy subsequently writes Elizabeth a letter in which he explains that he separated the couple largely because he did not believe Jane returned Bingley's affection. He also discloses that Wickham, after squandering his inheritance, tried to marry Darcy's then 15-year-old sister in an attempt to gain possession of her fortune. With these revelations, Elizabeth begins to see Darcy in a new light. Shortly thereafter, the youngest Bennet sister, Lydia, elopes with Wickham. The news is met with great alarm by Elizabeth, since the scandalous affair, which is unlikely to end in marriage, could ruin the reputation of the other Bennet sisters. When she tells Darcy, he persuades Wickham to marry Lydia, offering him money despite Darcy's attempt to keep his intervention a secret. Elizabeth learns of his actions. At the encouragement of Darcy, Bingley subsequently returns, and he and Jane become engaged. Finally, Darcy proposes again to Elizabeth, who this time accepts. Characters in Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth Bennet, the central character, the protagonist of the novel Pride and Prejudice. The second daughter of Mr Bennett, Elizabeth is the most intelligent and sensible of the 5 Bennet sisters. She is well-read and quick-witted, with a tongue that occasionally proves too sharp for her own good. Her realization of Darcy's essential goodness eventually triumphs over her initial prejudice against him. Fitzwilliam Darcy, a wealthy gentleman, the master of Pemberley and the nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Though Darcy is intelligent and honest, his excess of pique causes him to look down on his social inferiors. Over the course of the novel, he tempers his class consciousness and learns to Though Darcy is intelligent and honest, his excess of pride causes him to look down on his social inferiors. Over the course of the novel, he tempers his class consciousness and learns to admire and love Elizabeth for her strong character. Jane Bennet, the eldest and most beautiful Bennet sister. Jane is more reserved and gentler than Elizabeth. The easy pleasantness with which she and Bingley interact contrasts starkly with the mutual distaste that marks the encounters between Elizabeth and Darcy. Charles Bingley, Darcy's considerably wealthy best friend. Bingley's purchase of Netherfield, an estate near the Bennets, serves as the impetus for the novel. He is a genial, well-intentioned gentleman whose easygoing nature contrasts with Darcy's initially discourteous demeanor. He is blissfully uncaring about class differences. Mr Bennett, the patriarch of the Bennet family, a gentleman of modest income with 5 unmarried daughters. Mr Bennett has a sarcastic, cynical sense of humor that he uses to purposefully irritate his wife. Though he loves his daughters, Elizabeth in particular, he often fails as a parent, preferring to withdraw from the never-ending marriage concerns of the women around him rather than offer help. Mrs. Bennett, Mr. Bennett's wife, a foolish, noisy woman whose only goal in life is to see her daughters married. Because of her low breeding and often unbecoming behavior, Mrs. Bennett often repels the very suitors whom she tries to attract for her daughters. George Wickham, a handsome, fortune-hunting militia officer. Wickham's good looks and charm attract Elizabeth initially, but Darcy's revelation about Wickham's disreputable past clues her into his true nature and simultaneously draws her closer to Darcy. Lydia Bennet, the youngest Bennet sister. She is gossipy, immature and self She is gossipy, immature, and self-involved. Unlike Elizabeth, Lydia flings herself headlong into romance and ends up running off with Wickham. Mr. Collins, a pompous, generally idiotic clergyman who stands to inherit Mr. Bennett's property. Mr. Collins' own social status is nothing to brag about, but he takes great pains to let everyone and anyone know that Lady Catherine de Bourgh serves as his patroness. He is the worst combination of snobbish and obsequious. Miss Bingley, Bingley's snobbish sister. Miss Bingley bears inordinate disdain for Elizabeth's middle-class background. Her vain attempts to garner Darcy's attention cause Darcy to admire Elizabeth's self-possessed character even more. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, a rich, bossy noble woman, Mr. Collins' patron and Darcy's aunt. Lady Catherine epitomizes class snobbery, especially in her attempts to order the middle-class Elizabeth away from her well-bred nephew. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, Mrs. Bennet's brother and his wife. The Gardiners, caring, nurturing, and full of common sense, often prove to be better parents to the Bennet daughters than Mr. Bennet and his wife. Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's dear friend, pragmatic while Elizabeth romantic and also 6 years older than Elizabeth. Charlotte does not view love as the most vital component of a marriage. She is more interested in having a comfortable home. Thus, when Mr. Collins proposes, she accepts. Georgiana Darcy, Darcy's sister, she is immensely pretty and just as shy. She has great skill at playing the pianoforte. Mary Bennet, the middle Bennet sister, bookish and pedantic. Catherine Bennet, the fourth Bennet sister. Like Lydia, she is girlishly enthralled with the soldiers. And that's the end of the character's description in Pride and Prejudice. Now we are going through the summary from chapter 1 to 20. Chapter 1. Mrs. Bennet announces to her husband that Netherfield Park, a large Hertfordshire estate, has been let to a Mr. Bingley, a young man of fortune from the north of England, who she hopes may marry one of their 5 daughters. She attempts to persuade him to visit the newcomer and is frustrated when he says that he has no intention of doing so. Chapter 2. Mr. Bennett continues to let his family think that he will not visit Mr. Bingley, when in fact he has already done so. They are all delighted when he reveals the truth. Chapter 3. Mr. Bingley, after having returned Mr. Bennett's visit and made a short trip to London, makes his first appearance at a local ball. With him are his sisters Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley and his friend Mr. Darcy, who were all staying with him at Netherfield. Darcy is admired at first for his good looks and large fortune, but soon offends everyone by his disdainful, proud manner or arrogant manner. He is particularly rude to Elizabeth Bennet, the second of the Bennet sisters, by refusing to dance with her, saying she is not handsome enough. Mr. Bingley, by contrast, is universally liked and distinguishes Jane Bennet, the eldest and most beautiful of the sisters, by dancing with her twice. Chapter 4. Jane confesses to Elizabeth how much she likes Mr. Bingley, and in replying, Elizabeth comments on her sister's ability to see the good in everyone. She herself is more given to cynicism. Austen then gives us more details about the Bingleys. The sisters are proud and conceited. Mr. Bingley is expected to purchase property soon and is renting Netherfield as a temporary measure. Mr. Darcy is cleverer than Bingley, but haughty, reserved and fastidious. Chapter 5. Charlotte Lucas, the eldest daughter of some of the Bennet's neighbours and Elizabeth's friends, comes to Longbourn, the village where the Bennets live, to talk over the ball. Bingley's apparent admiration of Jane and Darcy's pride is the main topic of conversation. Chapter 6. The acquaintance between the Bingleys and the Bennets is advanced by 2 further visits. Elizabeth remarks to Charlotte that although Jane is attracted to Bingley, she will keep this well hidden by her unwavering composure of temper. Charlotte replies that Jane would do better to encourage Bingley if she hopes to make him ask her to marry him. Charlotte is much more concerned than Elizabeth with the importance of marrying well, feeling that falling in love is secondary to being comfortably settled. At a party at the Lucases, Darcy begins to notice Elizabeth and even asks her to dance, which she declines. Chapter 7. We learn that because Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have no sons, the Longbourn estate will be inherited by a distant relation. The younger daughters, Kitty and Lydia, have been introduced to some officers of a regiment encamped at Meryton, a nearby town, by their aunt and uncle Phillips, and can think of nothing else. Jane is invited to Netherfield, and Mrs. Bennet insists on her going on horseback in the hope that she will catch cold from riding in bad weather and be forced to stay longer. The next day, news arrives that Jane is indeed ill, and Elizabeth decides to walk to Netherfield to visit her. She is invited to stay in order to be near her sister while she is unwell. Chapter 8. Elizabeth spends the evening with Bingley, his 2 sisters and Darcy. Darcy continues to admire her, which provokes the jealousy of Miss Bingley, who it becomes clear is hoping to marry Darcy herself. While she is with her sister, Miss Bingley takes the opportunity of disparaging Elizabeth and her vulgar relations. By the end of the evening, Jane is no better, and it is agreed that a doctor will be called in the morning. Chapter 9. Jane is slightly better on the following morning, but Nevertheless, Elizabeth wants her mother's opinion. Mrs. Bennett arrives with Kitty and Lydia. She embarrasses Elizabeth with her tactless remarks, and Lydia reminds Bingley of his promise to give a ball at Netherfield, which he confirms he will do as soon as Jane is better. Chapter 10. As Jane continues to recover, Elizabeth spends another evening and day with Bingley and his guests. Miss Bingley distracts Darcy from writing to his sister with compliments on his handwriting and later teases him about Elizabeth. Darcy himself becomes more and more attracted to Elizabeth. Chapter 12. Jane and Elizabeth return home in Bingley's carriage. Darcy is glad to see Elizabeth go, fearing that she has realized that he likes her. Chapter 13. Mr. Bennett reads a letter from his cousin Mr. Collins, who will inherit the Longbourn estate and who is expected there that day. He introduces himself as a clergyman who has recently acquired the patronage of a Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Since the death of his father, who had fallen out with Mr. Bennett, he hopes that the two families can be reunited. He writes pompously and condescendingly. On his arrival, Mr. Collins hints that he intends to choose a wife from among the Bennett sisters. Chapter 14. After dinner, Mr. Bennett draws out his guest on the subject of his patroness. He praises her extravagantly, adding that she has a daughter whose ill health has prevented her socializing much. Chapter 15. Mr. Collins hints to Mrs. Bennet that he hopes to choose Jane as his wife. She tells him that she is likely to become engaged soon. He promptly transfers his choice of Elizabeth. The girls with Mr. Collins walk to Meryton, where they meet some of the officers and are introduced to another, Mr. Wickham, whom they all like immediately. Bingley and Darcy arrive but react dramatically when they see Mr. Wickham and withdraw at once. The Longbourn party moves on to visit the girls on Phillips, who invites them all to a party the next evening. Chapter 16. At the Phillips, Elizabeth and Wickham fall into conversation. He explains to her why he and Darcy meet so awkwardly the day before. His father was Darcy's father's steward and he himself grew up at Pemberley, Darcy's estate. Darcy's father had promised to set him up as a clergyman, but he died before this could happen, and Darcy refused to honor his father's promise. Wickham claims that this was out of dislike and jealousy. Elizabeth sympathizes with him that his status in life has been so drastically reduced. Wickham also tells Elizabeth that Lady Catherine de Bourgh is Darcy's aunt and that he is expected to marry her daughter. He also gives a report of Darcy's much younger sister as equal to her brother in pride. Chapter 17. Elizabeth repeats to Jane what Wickham has told her. Bingley arrives to invite them all to the promised ball at Netherfield. Mr. Collins immediately asks Elizabeth to dance the first two dances with him, from which she begins to suspect that he may propose to her. Chapter 18. At the ball, Elizabeth is disappointed to find that Wickham is not there and hears that he has stayed away in order to avoid Darcy. This increases her dislike of him and determination not to be pleasant to him. Darcy, however, asks her to dance. They struggle for conversation and Elizabeth finds refuge in barbed banter. Miss Bingley approaches Elizabeth to contradict Wickham's report of Darcy's cruelty, to which Elizabeth replies disdainfully. Mr. Collins introduces himself to Darcy because of the Debord's connection, which embarrasses Elizabeth. Her family then humiliate her further. Mrs. Bennett talks openly about her conviction that Jane and Bingley will soon be married and marry. The studious sister shows off at the piano. The Longbourn party is the last to leave. Mrs. Bennet returns home, complacent in the thought of soon having two daughters married. Chapter 19. Mr. Collins proposes to Elizabeth. He will not accept her refusal, convinced that she is merely following fashion by showing reluctance and confident that he will succeed in the end. Chapter 20. Mrs. Bennet is furious when she hears that Elizabeth has turned Mr. Collins down and appeals to Mr. Bennet to use his influence on her. He supports her refusal, leaving his wife to attempt to persuade Elizabeth to accept him. When it becomes clear that she is adamant, Mr. Collins withdraws his proposal. And that's the end of the lesson in week 8. Thank you very much for being with me. Bye bye.